Thanks very much. I'll just briefly give you a little bit more background to me, because it frames the discussion. In addition to being the CEO of Nomadic, which is the technology arm of Fragomen, the immigration law firm, in a previous life I was a diplomat in the immigration service with the Australian government. I also worked as a political advisor to the immigration minister before going into private practice and advocating on behalf of companies with governments on streamlining immigration and making them more user-friendly. And so I just wanted to not big note myself, but to give that background to frame some of the comments I'm going to make and then lead into Tony. Tony, do you want to just quickly add anything on your side?
Yes, hello everybody. My name's Tony Smith. I'm a former civil servant in the Home Office, worked 40 years there, man and boy really, in the Border and Immigration Department. And for the last 8 years, I've been an independent border management consultant, working with a number of governments around the world on immigration and border strategy. Thanks, Brendan.
So we're going to talk about Big Brother and what governments are doing, because, I just did a session on how technology can work and everything else. But at the end of the day, it's really what you do with your global mobility program is going to be largely determined by what governments are expecting, and so this is a sort of a discussion between the two of us around what we see as the trends that governments are going to do, and also what business should do to prepare for that. But let me make a couple of comments before I hand over to Tony and talk about the government element. And that is that immigration is a fraught political issue for every government. It drives a lot of government thinking around border control, around the economy, and social issues and everything else. It is also what I consider to be the line in the sand when it comes to national sovereignty considerations. I had someone from a very large multinational sort of complain to me about the complexity of immigration law and say, but I work for this company. Why can't we get a company visa for the whole world? Why can't we just have one set of rules because we're such a big corporation? And of course, I had to let them down rather brutally because at the end of the day, governments don't care. Their job is, well, their primary consideration is to be re-elected if it's a democracy. And they do want to encourage business, but they are mindful of controlling who is entering the country in whatever form that is, whether it's making sure they've got work authorization or they've got a visa. And so what do we see governments doing post-pandemic? And the pandemic has driven profound change in governments' thinking, because they're far more interested now than ever in knowing who's in their border and having a degree of control around that. And so, one of the things that Tony's going to be speaking to is the trend to basically do away with things like visa waiver programs in favour of some kind of visa regime. But the real focus in them doing that is to use modern technology to do so. So with that sort of, overarching comment, I'll hand to Tony to sort of talk about his view, given that he works with governments in developing these sorts of border control programs, his view of what we should be looking for in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the whole business. That's border immigration, movement of people and goods as well, for that matter, is ripe for digital disruption. I spent a lot of time, as I said, working in the Home Office, and that was based on a lot of paper-based systems. But most countries, most governments that I work with now are moving away from paper-based systems to digital systems, and they will therefore expect the private sector to move with them. But as many of you will probably know, the private sector are actually, in many cases, some way ahead of a government in terms of digital technology in this field. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview of where, in my experience, governments are coming from. And I use the word plural because I have been involved since I retired from the UK Home Office in drafting border strategies in at least 4 or 5 different parts of the world. The vision is always the same, in my experience, which is the ambition is to move people, or facilitate the movement of people and goods across borders, the genuine compliant movement of people and goods across borders, because of course that promotes economic growth. So invariably the vision statement when you look at strategies in different countries is that, to facilitate. But of course there's always this element that they're very, very nervous about compliance, and that migration needs to be lawful, and we can't really have goods entering, crossing borders that are going to be harmful to our communities. So that's the constant balance that you're striking. I mean, I'd give you sort of 3 main principles that I preach whenever I talk about this. Which are probably also universal, although they're being delivered in different ways in different countries. But the first one is what we call the multiple borders strategy, which is about what we call pushing the border out. In other words, border control and immigration control as well, for that matter, is now no longer a line at an airport or at a land border crossing point where documents are inspected. It's actually a series of transactions. And the more that you can conduct those transactions before people start to travel, then it's much, much easier to control the passage of people into your country when they actually arrive. So that's the first one, pushing the border out. The second one is called integrated border management. And that's where a lot of countries have failed. If you ever study border control and you look at the major problems we've had with 9/11, 7/7, the Paris attacks, it's been a lack of data sharing between different government departments and agencies, not just at international level, but actually at national level as well. So this is, I suppose, where the big brother argument comes in, is that governments do really need to share intelligence and information with one another to make sure that they stop the entry and admission of harm into their communities. And the third one, which is probably the most dynamic at the moment, is the end-to-end identity of somebody. So, when I was on the border, you'd hand me a paper booklet with a photo in it that might or might not look like you. I was often asked, how on earth would I know whether that's you or not? Well, the short answer was I probably didn't, other than talking to you. And there were very little safeguards. But now we have this technology with biometrics, and the 3 approved biometrics approved by ICAO. That's facial recognition, iris technology, and fingerprint technology, increasingly pervading this business, so that you can recognize somebody not by their name on their passport, but by their biometric. And that does bring with it all kinds of advantages. So those 3 principles taken together with the overarching business statements, where governments are coming from. I think the problem, Brendan, as we discussed before, you and I, is that there isn't any real international collaboration on this. There's no global governance structure for this. It's very much country by country. So, there's lots of legacy systems, and countries are developing in isolation of one another their own border and immigration systems, which isn't really helpful, to your aspiration of having some kind of a global visa.
Yeah, and I don't think you're ever going to see that. That's what I mean about it being the last bastion of national sovereignty. The concept of, it is everyone's dream that there be a greater consistency across the world, but it's somewhat of a pipe dream. I'm certainly not going to see it in my lifetime. I mean, there's a commonality of information. Every immigration system in some form is looking for the same basic data. Who are you? What are you doing? how long are you staying? Are you a threat? And how can I be sure you've gone? That's really what immigration systems are all about. So when you look at what's coming down the line in terms of immigration, when we talk about are you a threat, that doesn't just mean are you a threat to security? Are you a terrorist or someone who's going to do physical harm? It can be, are you a threat to the labour market? Are you undermining the jobs market, which is so politically sensitive? In fact, I would argue the primary driver behind Brexit. And there's a whole lot of political domino discussions that I lecture on that I won't go into today. But governments, when they talk about the concept of are you a threat or are you going to bring harm, it's around that compliance on what are the activities and do you have authorization to do it. So they are beefing up their monitoring of business travellers, of posted worker within the EU and the like. Work permits. Where you need a work permit or other work authorization, that's really done. That there are rules. They will adjust those rules as they want, but their next focus is really on that business traveller and focusing. So on that and making sure that they're not undermining the business, the labour market by working while on a business visa. But exactly to Tony's original point, governments aren't wanting to shut the border. Standing aside from the pandemic, they're not looking to shut borders. They are wanting to facilitate. And we'll turn to the issue of technology and how they're doing that in just a moment. But one of the things around the concept of the multiple border strategy and the pre-processing is the visa waiver program. Visa waiver programs have traditionally been how governments will tier their approach. They say, if you're from this country, you can travel visa free. If you're from this country, there's a higher level of requirement. And if you're from this group of countries, it's at the highest level. You need to come into the embassy or the consulate and for a proper interview. And there's an actual vignette put into your passport, a label put in your passport. That's how they've been doing it in the past. But exactly to Tony's point, that means that if there is a problem, it's having to be dealt with at the border and at the airport in Heathrow or in Sydney or wherever. And that creates real challenges for governments because they don't want that. They'd rather deal with that in advance. And so you have the development of electronic travel authority type arrangements, the ETIAS visa in the EU, the UK ETA system. And I'll hand back to Tony in a second to discuss that. But the other thing that I just warn you from the business community's perspective, because that's my area of focus, from the business community, you have to be careful with all of this. It will facilitate genuine travel. It will make life easier. But there is this massive misconception that a visa waiver program means I can go into a country without a visa, stay for 3 months and do whatever I want. And even in a visa waiver program, that's not accurate. You're still subject to the rules. But with a ETA system, where even if it's an easy electronic visa, enforcement of that is going to be so much easier. And part of that goes back to the issue of data sharing. Governments will be sharing more data. They will be gathering more data. One of the big issues is there will be a clearer picture of when you not just enter the country, but when you depart the country. So that when you come back for your next trip, and you've stayed, 3 months and you didn't come to notice until you left the airport, but next time they're going to be at a much greater risk of coming to notice with the immigration authorities to check. Back to my point, are you a threat because you've been undermining the labour market in whatever form? So, Tony, do you want to just talk about, the concept, what's driving the UK's approach to the electronic authorities and governments and how they're approaching it?
Yeah, well, I think, sparing your blushes, Brendan, Australia was the first one to introduce the Electronic Travel Authority for the Sydney Olympics in 2000. So they've been doing this for 20 years or so. And I quite often get asked, who's got the best border in the world? Because that's quite a snazzy, a line for senior politicians to be able to say we've got a fantastic border, but no two borders are the same, of course, and it's easily deliverable in a place like Australia, which is, it's an awful long way away. Plenty of time to do the risk assessments, while people are on their route. And I think most of your country is surrounded by crocodiles, isn't it? So it's not an easy place to pervade. Whereas if you look at countries with land borders like the US, and you can see some of the problems now that are happening on the southern US border with record numbers, as I understand it, of irregular migrants. We've got similar problems in the EU as well. This is a big political hot potato, but I think the lesson that I've picked up is they are all moving towards this concept that you described, which is everything's got an E in front of it now, which I think stands for electronic most of the time. So you've got e-passports with a chip in it, which got all the data in the chip that's actually in the document itself. So I'll argue you don't even need the booklet anymore. Some people are advocating that. You've got an e-gate, which can open the chip and match you to your photo on your chip. So, there's your identity verified. And you've even got now this idea of e-visas, Brendan, where, people are talking about, well, do we actually need people queuing up outside embassies around the world? Can we not find another way of verifying who they are and that the credentials they're presenting to pass your border, whether as a visitor or for a migrant, actually pass muster without the current systems that are in play? I just wanted to touch on the ending of free movement. So the argument about free movement, Brendan, is a really interesting one. So people would assume that because of Brexit, we don't have free movement anymore with the EU, free movement of people, which is true. But actually, we never really had free movement anyway, because the UK and Ireland have always opted out of the Schengen Agreement. So anybody coming to the UK, which at the end of the day, when taken with Ireland, we don't have any land borders either. And so we are able actually to check everybody when they arrive at our border here, whether they arrive by sea or through the Channel Tunnel or by air. So everybody has always been checked, even when we were in the EU at the UK border. The difference has been that for EU passport holders who held a chipped passport, well, they could use the same gates that British people could use, because there were no immigration restrictions. You could just come here and stay here from any of the 28 member states and work, and nobody would challenge you. All you really needed to show was that you were a European citizen. The problem we had, and I did a lot of this in enforcement in London, was a lot of people who were not European citizens were passing themselves off as such by purchasing forged EU identity cards to pass themselves off as European citizens, which would enable them, of course, to access services like employment and health and so on, to which they were not entitled, which is one reason why we've now phased out to a great extent the admission of people using an EU identity card, and we're insisting upon the ICAO standard chip passport. But yes, we will be introducing an electronic traveller authority on everybody coming here other than British and Irish people, and the EU are going to be doing the same thing for what they call third country nationals. So if you're not an EU citizen, which now includes British citizens, then you're going to have to get prior authority to travel. So you can see where this is going, Brendan. There is increasingly a desire to push this out onto platforms so that data and biometrics and information is submitted before you travel. And we're seeing this now pervading, aren't we, with COVID? And we have huge problems here with people waiting for 7 hours trying to get their mobile phone to work because the battery's flat, to find the whatever form it is that they need to show to the border officer that they've actually got their jabs or they've done their health declarations. And all of this stuff is really, which is ripe for the digitisation, and I know a number of companies that are in this now. And what I foresee is that we will see increasingly a digital disruption of health credentials, as well as ETS, as well as visa credentials into digital wallets, which would enable regular travellers such as you and I to be able to pull these things up from our mobile phone in the same way as we do for boarding passes and things like that. We're some way off that yet, and of course there'll be a lot of problems, but where we're struggling is to get this off the ground, really. I think we need some real innovative thinking in some countries to try and get things moving, because you won't be able to do this for the whole of the travelling population immediately. But I know now there are a significant number of global travellers that would be very happy to sign up to some kind of a global system, a bit like global entry, where you just register your data, you keep the data yourself, it's your data, but you can push that through to Australia or Canada or the US or the EU or wherever you're going without having to make a separate application on every occasion. But we're not there yet, Brendan, and I think we've got some way to go in persuading the international border community to work together on something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so the advent of blockchain technology, which creates the digital passport, etc., is what we're looking for as part of the solution going forward. Because at the moment, a whole lot of obligation falls to the traveller to be able to make sure they're applying for the right visa with the right compliance. But the penalties, and this is something again started by Australia. I'm now based in the US, just to be clear. But Australia really started the trend to move away from penalising the individual for non-compliance, and actually embroil or engage the body corporate, the employer, in the penalties. So they still get to fine the individual, still get to deport them or do whatever they want to do in instances of non-compliance, but more severely involve the company in the penalty regime associated with it. So when we talk about things like the digital passport or digital wallet, and being able to pull the information from country to country, it's a two-edged sword. It does make life easier in many ways for the traveller and for the company, but that information that is flowing around carries the risk that the governments know so much more. And so they're able to make assessments about travellers that much more easily, travellers that are frequently going to a country. The US-Canadian border is notorious for looking for people that are constantly commuting between the two. And I sometimes think that they've sort of redeclared the War of 1812 because they're constantly looking for people that are travelling between the two jurisdictions who are going beyond what would be considered reasonable business travel. And so as governments gather this information, they're able to apply artificial intelligence to that data and start to follow the patterns that, Nomadic, I'll use my company as an example. Nomadic is creating a profile of an organization that is not taking compliance seriously. And so they can target much more effectively. And this is a challenge because most companies want to be compliant, but no company is going to be 100% compliant. It's not possible, not without shutting your business down, basically. And there's a whole lot of grey in the middle. And so you've got to have a system where you can control the individuals. You've got to be a little careful as a company in allowing the individuals too much freedom in terms of the visa, travel, etc., using digital wallets and the like, without an overlay of control, because, as I said, the penalties accrue to the organisation. Much more than to the individual. So if that's the case, you have an obligation to your company to make sure that you're putting in place some degree of appropriate control. And so, our company, which is, as I said, focused on that short-term travel, is building technology that integrates with the government system rather than is completely separate. That we can share the information that's appropriate, but we can work with the government to sort of highlight where risks are starting to build, where the travel patterns of individuals are likely to lead to some compliance issue around that. And most importantly, to make sure within what is a reasonable environment, ensure that you have a high degree, an acceptable degree of compliance, because short-term travel, and that's really where the vast majority of border control issues apply. Because if someone's got a work permit, they've got a work permit. They'll enter the country after the formalities, and they'll start their assignment. But where the scrutiny is going to be increasingly around those short-term travellers. And short-term travellers includes intra-EU travel, the posted worker notifications, the fact that UK nationals are now subject, while they do have the ability to travel to Europe, exactly as Tony said, and they're going to be subject to the universal ETIAS, but also they're now subject to the 90-day limitation rule. So they can't be inside the Schengen region for more than 90 days in a 180-day period. That's going to come as a big shock to a whole lot of British nationals who are used to being able, I should clarify, it applies to personal travel as well as business travel. So it's just a straight calculation of the days. And so a whole lot of people are going to be caught out because they spent, a month of their summer holidays sitting in Spain. And they've with that and other weekends in Paris or whatever, they've suddenly hit the 90-day rule. It's not negotiable. And so that really important business trip, they're not able to do it. And the point in this is, with the advent of electronic borders, electronic visas, and ETAs and all of the regimes that are coming in, with the advent of that, governments are going to know so much more than they did a few years ago. And this is in part driven also by the pandemic, because they've invested an enormous amount of money in building an infrastructure around controlling entry at borders much more. This is an extreme example, of course, but that infrastructure isn't going to go away. So, there will be things like COVID passports, or it won't be a COVID passport, it'll be a vaccination passport. And they're going to be ready for the next one, so that we don't experience the sort of disruption that we've had. But all of that comes at a cost of personal privacy, of the flexibility that everyone is used to in terms of their business travel population, and sort of slipping under the radar so that Big Brother doesn't notice that they're there. Those days, are going to increasingly become in the past, and individuals' right to complain about it, I shouldn't be needing to get a vaccination, doesn't apply. If you're crossing a border, you're subject to that country's rules, not where you originally came from. So, and we are seeing this in the advent of greater technology in the Middle East. The government in the UAE is really advanced in its thinking around technology. Australia, as Tony mentioned, has been at the forefront of this for years. They're trialling the concept of phasing out passports altogether. The US has already introduced the ESTA visa. The ETIAS visa is coming in for the EU, and the UK has now announced a universal visa requirement for entry for everybody that's coming. And this is all about control and allowing facilitation, but control and knowing what's happening. And you as businesses, so what should the business community be doing here? You need to be making sure that you're ready with that. You've got to start thinking about maybe having adequate program management in place for your business travellers or your short-term cross-border travellers. I would encourage you to engage in various forums where you can lobby on behalf of the business community, and I'm happy to help with this, with identifying them, but where you can lobby for streamlining of these processes so that genuine business can be conducted with a minimum of disruption, and in fact that you can improve it. That you need to educate your business as the global mobility people, the business, that a laissez-faire approach to business travel isn't going to be possible going forward because of all of the factors that we've just talked about. And so there's a need for this preparation. There's a need to use technology. The only way that you can handle this is through the effective use of technology. It won't work any other way. There's no manual process. There's no sort of big call center to provide advice on activities and what's permissible and everything else. It's all about knowledge and the application of that knowledge through technology, and then integration with the government systems to streamline the entire process. And Tony, you're talking to governments all the time, so I'll throw back to you. You're talking to governments all the time. You would reinforce the view that they're open to these discussions from the business community.
Yes, they are, very much so, Brendan, but I'm glad you raised the question of in-country compliance, because a lot of the companies I work with think the border ends when you land at the airport and you're through the border. Of course it doesn't, does it? And so we do talk about the end-to-end compliance arrangement. What are the circumstances that were given to enable that permission? Is it a long-term permit, a short-term permit? What does it allow the applicant to do while they're in country? So the continuum actually runs from the very first point of application abroad right the way through to entry and stay, which could be temporary or permanent, and either a path to citizenship or exit. And that's where a lot of these things break down. I just want to tell you two quick stories about the UK, Brendan, which might resonate with people. One good and one bad. The good one is that we said when we left the EU that we would allow Europeans who were already in this country to stay, and we gave them quite a lot of time to apply. I think about 18 months, and we did it because we were worried about the number of applications not being able to cope with them through a mobile app. So you could actually upload your passport data, assuming you had the a passport, a proper passport, EU passport. You would upload that data onto a mobile app. We'd verify your identity remotely. And, we logged 6 million applications without losing any passports, without long queues outside our immigration offices. And that has been heralded as one of the most successful technology programs ever seen in the UK Home Office, and even by lobby groups. So that was really, really good that we've got this way of getting these applications into the department digitally. But you may have heard of Windrush and the Windrush scandal. And that was because we've got a great number of people living in this country who don't have a passport. In fact, they don't have any form of real form of national identity. We don't have national identity cards in the UK. And so, of course, when they tried to codify this and introduce what they call the hostile environment, now the compliant environment, which, as you say, puts burdens upon colleges and employers to check documents. They're not immigration officers. They don't really know. And so if somebody comes up and says, well, I've been living here for 50 years, but I haven't got a passport and I haven't got anything to show it, then they'll say, well, you're not working here and you're not staying here either, because I don't want to get in trouble with the Home Office. You better go and see them. What's made it even worse, of course, they go and see the Home Office. And the Home Office started issuing with deportation notices when they were absolutely exempt from deportation by virtue of being Commonwealth citizens who've lived here for many, many years. So you do need to tie your identity management strategy with your entitlement strategy so that it's very, very clear and transparent that you have something to show. And this push towards technology can be an adverse reaction if you find people that actually are not technology aware. They don't know, they don't have a mobile smartphone, and they're looking for a job. They're allowed to be here and they haven't got a token. We're not issuing tokens to EU citizens who've been granted settlement. You see, there's this share code, and we're already starting to see problems. So I am lobbying my old department a little bit to say, look, be very, very careful here, because we don't want another EU windrush, do we? And we don't want to start deporting Europeans because they don't have permission to be here, when actually they do. They've actually lived here for 50 or 60 years, in fact, some of them, but they don't have anything to prove it. So I think the identity strand coupled with the immigration strand, the border strand, is really, really interesting how we describe this end-to-end continuum. But the only real answer, Brendan, is collaboration. That's why I set up IBMATA, to bring together border agencies with the very best technology companies around the world and some academic thinkers to say, how can we work together on this system, which isn't going to harm people that are perfectly entitled to move across borders and live in countries, promote your vision, but at the same time use the technology to weed out the non-compliant. That's the mission. I think it's a common mission between private sector and governments worldwide. I know it is because I speak to both sides regularly, but trying to do it and get them to collaborate, particularly in a dynamic labour market where people don't do what I did. They don't stay in the Home Office for 40 years anymore, 2 or 3 years, and you're out of there in another department, or very possibly even into the private sector. It's hard to get that continuity of debate, but that's something we ought to strive for, I think, all of us in this business, to make sure that we continue to work together to try and bring governments and private sector together on a long-lasting solution which satisfies all sides. It's a big, big ask, and I'm sure it will go on for a great many years after I've finished doing it. But it is a fascinating topic. So thanks very much for having me on this event. I think it's a fascinating discussion.
Thanks. If I can sort of finish with a couple of summary points in all of this that are relevant to you as the audience. So we've talked about what governments are going to do, and they're going to just do this. So they're going to move forward. They'll listen to discussion from the business community. If it's well coordinated, you can influence that. But the trend is set. This is where they're going. So what do you have to really do? The biggest issue really is to start looking at the short-term business travel in the immigration environment when it comes to global mobility. Look at the business traveller program, because that's where the greatest change is coming. That's where there's going to be confusion. That's where people will no longer get turned away at the airport because that's actually quite difficult to do. They'll get simply stopped from boarding the plane. That's easy for a government to do because they don't care that they're having a meltdown at the airport. It's not at their airport. And so these sorts of changes are coming, and it's you really need to sort of start looking at the business travel program, which has always been the sort of poor cousin. No one wants to own the business traveller program, not the Law Department, not Global Mobility, not HR, but it is going to be necessary for that to happen going forward. So on that, We are absolutely at the end of our time. I'm hoping you found that a useful discussion about where governments are sort of heading, and what you should be doing about that. And with that, I'll hand back to Alex, and thank you very much.